Great. Well, it's a real pleasure to introduce two new speakers tonight, both, again, friends of mine. First of all, our opening speaker is Romel Regalado Bagares, JD, who is, among other things, a graduate of the master's program in Christian social and political philosophy at the Free University of Amsterdam. He's a lawyer with experience in such diverse areas as renewable energy, microfinance, free expression, data privacy, human rights, and public interest law. He's a professorial lecturer at the Polytechnic University of the Philippines and the Philippine Judicial Academy of the Supreme Court of the Philippines. Most of you already have heard that it is now 4 a.m. for Romel, so I think before he even opens his mouth, I think we ought to give him an opening round of applause for disturbing his night and being willing to speak to us. So we're really looking forward to hearing from you, Romel, in a minute. Elaine Storkey, Dr. Elaine Storkey, Doctor of Divinity, is known to many of you. She's a writer, broadcaster, and academic widely known for her broadcasting and media appearances. She works in pretty much every discipline, actually, but in particular, social sciences, philosophy, theology, and other areas too. She is the former executive director of the London Institute for Contemporary Christianity, which was founded by John Stott. She's also a former president of Tear Fund, the Global Development Agency, and she is now a lifetime member of Newnham College, Cambridge, and so was telling us beforehand that means that Cambridge University cannot get rid of her as long as she's alive. So good for you, Elaine. So welcome both of you. Really looking forward to the interaction and what we've both got to say. And so now let me hand over to Romel. Romel, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Jonathan. Thank you for the opportunity to talk to this group. My talk will be really brief. It is meant to spark a conversation among us for something that I think has not been adequately discussed among Reformational circles. But before I start, I would like to acknowledge Tinus van der Walt for an earlier discussion we've had in the same topic, and for the guidance that is shared to me about what I need to put across. Some of that found their way in my talk. So let me begin. In the first few days of Trump's inauguration early this year, excited chatter in my social media feed came from an unexpected source: British, Scottish, and Australian feminists and gays and lesbians. They were celebrating his executive orders, reaffirming that there are only two sexes and protecting children from chemical and surgical mutilation. There was probably some gloating in the glee they unabashedly exhibited. The US Democrats had no one else to blame for their shocking loss to the Republicans, but themselves for pursuing a policy above anything else that catered to an extremist minority, to the exclusion of legitimate concerns raised by many for the safeguarding of women and children. Just months earlier, these same feminists, gays, and lesbians had pushed for the Cass report, which detailed the medical horrors visited on vulnerable children by an ideologically driven medical establishment. For those who have not been aware, the Cass report is the independent review of gender identity services for children and young people commissioned in 2020 by NHS England and NHS Improvement, and led by Dame Hilary Cass, a retired consultant, pediatrician, and former president of the Royal College of Pediatrics and Children. Reem Al-Salim, UN Special Rapporteur on Violence Against Women, its causes and consequences, also chimed in, praising Trump's executive orders. Al-Salim, a few months before, had written the Biden administration expressing concern about the latter's attempt to redefine sex as to include gender in Title IX of the landmark Education Amendments of 1972. The UN Special Rapporteur's letter took issue with the Biden administration's proposed amendment, which would threaten the safety and fairness in women and girls' sports by compelling schools to allow male athletes identifying as female to participate on female-only sports teams, in addition to the sharing of intimate spaces such as locker rooms and restrooms. The UN Special Rapporteur stated in the letter to the Biden administration, quote, The proposed Title X rule changes would have detrimental effects on the participation of biological women and girls in sports, including by denying them the opportunity to compete fairly, resulting in the loss of athletic and scholarship opportunities, unquote. At the UN, she had been practically a lone voice defending sex as a protected category under the Convention on the Elimination of Discrimination against Women. Al-Salim had become a pariah of sorts among UN colleagues who had embraced the very same gender ideology parroted and promoted across the board with the World Economic Forum, the United States Aid for International Development, the World Health Organization, the UNICEF, UNESCO. You name every acronym there is in international aid, diplomacy, business, and finance, and every single one of them is in on an advocacy that runs counter to the UN Special Rapporteur's core issues. The deep irony here shouldn't be lost on anyone who've known the Democrats' campaign attack on Trump. Here is a misogynist, convicted rapist, and felon receiving praise from the same sector that should be the very first to be seriously concerned about his re-election to office. The disorienting political shifts may be akin to what I experienced when the son of the late dictator Ferdinand E. Marcos Sr. won the Philippine presidential elections in 2022 against a candidate widely supported by reform-minded and progressive sectors, Leni Robredo, a candidate whom I campaigned for and voted for. And to get there, Ferdinand Bongbong Marcos allied with the family of his immediate predecessor, Rodrigo Roa Duterte, who was president, led a bloody drug war that had killed anywhere between 6,000 and 30,000 civilians. Now, barely 2 weeks ago, President Bongbong Marcos sent Duterte to The Hague to be tried by the International Criminal Court for crimes against humanity. In an exchange on social media with an American acquaintance, I quipped that an overwhelming number of US voters had apparently chosen someone who promised to protect the future of children from medical mutilation being promoted by a dangerous ideology, except that the same guy they voted for appears to be someone who is also out to drown the future of the same children with an American first policy that promises to exploit the environment to the hilt in the name of renewed American industrial vigor. On the other hand, if they chose Harris, they would have had someone who ticked all the boxes for a socially conscious and environmentally friendly world, except that she would also be denying vulnerable children the right to enjoy a better world she has promised to pursue. That reminded me of the biblical quote, "Suffer not the little children to come to me." An oversimplification, perhaps, but the stark contrast between these two choices presented to us may also be restated in this way. And I see that David Coites is here. It is one between a position whose idea of the state is unlimited choice enhancement and that of a state as a veritable extension of corporate interests to an extent not known before. Well, maybe not in such an out-and-out manner we have in the Trump-Elon Musk romance. What we have are indeed polarizing ideologies, and I've found it personally difficult sometimes to resist being pulled by one or the other side. Given the complexity of what is at stake, we need to be very careful as to how we orient ourselves to these opposing poles, which means that we need to be nuanced where we need to be in our critiques of leaders and their policies, and support them when they are in the right, and oppose them when they are in the wrong. Support should be delimited and circumspect. Full endorsement or identification with the leader, demographic group, or political party is therefore equally problematic. As someone who used to work as a journalist before I became a lawyer, there's also something we need to be aware of. Legacy media has a polarizing dynamic, even a main driver to polarization, because of its own unexamined position in the political spectrum. A case in point, when Trump was president at the height of COVID, he was pilloried as a purveyor of conspiracy theories by the New York Times for saying that the pandemic was the result of a Chinese lab leak. Now, a few days ago, the New York Times published an op-ed that said that we've all been duped. The lab leak theory is no longer just a conspiracy theory, but in fact, what had likely happened. Now, imagine the disorientation I felt when on the day Duterte was arrested to be flown to the Netherlands, I got a call from the New York Times for my comments. And on that note, I would like to end my brief talk and hope to hear from Elaine and also the others about what I've just said. Thank you.
Thank you very much indeed, Romel. You've been incredibly succinct and clear, and you've taken our discussion into new areas, which I'm sure is going to stir up some interesting conversation. Thank you so much. Elaine, you're responding to what you've just heard, and we
Yes,
can't wait to hear what you've got to say. Thanks, Elaine.
thank you so much, Romel. That was very succinct, but also actually extremely important. And I'm very glad you've taken the discussion in this direction. First and foremost, I think one of the undergirding issues here is the way that one might say Trump's common sense approach to everything. The guy who is no idiot when it comes to naming what needs to be named, irrespective of whether or not there is any intelligence about his naming. He manages to construct a rhetoric that appeals to practically everybody, because somewhere in his rhetoric is the throwaway line that they have been waiting for in their understanding. So an awful lot of people with single issues about which they care absolutely desperately hear in Trump's rhetoric an echo of those issues and then latch onto him, irrespective of all the other awful things that he stands for and everything that you have just said. And I think that's partly why so many evangelical Christians go for him, even though I don't think he cares two hoots about abortion. It's just a useful kind of ploy. They focus in that area. But now in the whole area of gender and transgender and misogyny, and this is a very, again, it's an issue that has drawn many people to Trump, irrespective of what their own ideology is and their own worldview on the issues that also attach themselves to gender and gender protection and so on. But there is one correction I wanted to make at the beginning, that you say that you were surprised to find that the gay, lesbians, and the transgender, the gay lesbians together were coming forward, and the radical feminists to challenge, to echo Trump's insistence that there are only two sexes. That's actually not quite what's happened, and certainly not what's happened in the UK and partly in the USA. And to understand what has happened in terms of their reaction to Trump, we have to go back 40 years. So 40 years ago, with third wave feminism, you had this incredible slogan, "Biology is destiny." And the whole idea of biology being destiny meant that we had to then construct two categories, sex and gender, which to some extent opposed each other. Sex was the biological givens that we are created with, and which come out in reproductive faculties and urination and a whole range of other things. So sex then wasn't challenged immediately, but gender is how we actually construct the roles and our preferences and our understanding and work and education and law. In other words, gender roles on the basis of our sexuality. And it was a careful construction in the 60s and 70s and so on, and very, very strongly abided by, except for one line of radical feminists, the Shulamith-Firestone line, we might say, who not only hung on to the idea that biology is destiny, but therefore the impetus and the challenge and the mandate that it was up to feminists to start controlling biology. And so she had this extraordinarily persuasive, for a lot of people, pattern of maintaining that rather than simply accept the givens of sexuality, so that women had children and the procreation went through that kind of process, we ought to be looking at the kind of research that would allow women to share their childbearing and child-rearing processes with, say, the embryo, the uterus of a large mammal, a pig or a goat or a cow and so on. And she wrote a lot of things in terms of trying to imagine the research where we could transplant the growing embryo from a woman's womb into another womb and bring it to full term. And part of her suggestions were that we could also adapt the male bowel so that men too could have the privilege and the pleasure of having babies. Now, Shulamith-Firestone didn't last very long, nor did her theories, because we moved away from them quite quickly into a much more fuller embrace of gender. But what's happened now is that 40 years on, the radical feminists, the ones who were the, if you like, the first group to want to ditch biology, have now come back to it full scale. And so the most of the emphasis on there are only there are only two sexes come from certainly the lesbians, but the radical feminists, they're called, they've been rudely called TERFs, the trans exclusionary radical feminists. And what that's done for the LGBTQI movement is it's split it up. So it's no longer a single coherent movement focusing on rights of bisexual, transsexual, gay and lesbian men and women. It's actually a movement that is an oppositional movement. So the radical feminists and radical lesbians have come out. They're now in strong opposition to the gay minority that is pushing very hard for transgender rights. And there's a constant warfare, to the extent that Julie Bindel, who is one of the arch feminists in the UK, said I mean, I was flabbergasted at this comment. She would rather be in a ballroom with Donald Trump than on a pride march with, and I won't name him, but the person that had been slating her opinions and so on. And what was she saying then? She was more or less saying, we're through with these gays. We actually want to really hang on to women's rights and the right of women to be women and have safe spaces, and not to have men who have never experienced what it's like to be going through puberty as a woman, difficulties as a woman, violence as a woman, suddenly deciding that they are women and they want all the privileges of being recognized as women at a later stage. So a lot of their attack is against trans women, i.e. male men with, or people with male anatomy and hormones who have now become gender aware and want to present as women. But they also have a problem with trans men, in that they say, for different reasons. And why trans men exist is because the girls who would normally just have been quite happy to be lesbians now have been talked out of that and feel that they really don't like what it's like to be a woman as you're going through puberty and you're struggling with all the kind of oppositional forces and often very bad treatment from men. So they actually would want to join the men as a sort of protest. So on both fields, that you get radical feminists opposed to the status quo. Now, I entirely agree that the Democrats were completely idiotic in not picking this up. And a lot of the liberal kind of progressive stance taken in a range of areas which relate to gender were missing the point all the time, not only in terms of gender, but also in terms of abortion. I mean, why Kamala did not say there must be freedom of conscience here. We must protect those who in conscience cannot actually go forward and agree that children should be aborted within the health services, for example, but she didn't. She had a golden opportunity to allow conscience to be directive in the way in which we handle the law and the way in which we handle people's behavior and so on, and similarly in other areas. So I think they did shoot themselves in the foot in a whole range of ways. And of course, the person who is the victor is the one who is throwing out these common sense ideas. Of course, there's only two sexes. Of course, babies have the right to be born and so on, into an arena where people listen to the common sense and say, OK, this is my guy. This is whom I want to follow. So I think it is complicated. And where we go from here, I don't know. Because within the circles that I kind of think in and move in, there's a great deal of consternation. I mean, women really do not like the idea that our radical feminist sisters are now actually even prepared to countenance the idea that Trump has some good in him or something worth listening to. And so it's almost splitting the radical feminist movement itself. Who wants to join a group that is going to adulate a misogynist, rapist, and actually a man who has no idea whatsoever what governance is really about, a man who is simply a dealer, a man who is simply in the place of a brain has a mouth and uses that mouth in order to kind of spread things that people are going to be dissenting about right, left and centre. So I think it's complicated. I think it's very interesting. What should Christians do about it? I think we have to be incredibly careful about not jumping in on one side or another. I have personally, I've got quite strong views within the feminist movement as to what we need to do in terms of understanding gender and understanding sexuality and bringing them together in a clear way. But nor do we kind of then start to enthrone, as we are doing often in the church, the status quo. And if the status quo moves to being a trans-affirming status quo, I've heard it said, and I've sat on committees that have said, okay, we now need a liturgy for transitioning. So rather than just either ignore people when they're transitioning or pretend it's not in our field and we don't need to do anything about it, why don't we have a liturgy so that we can celebrate the transitioning of a person who is now wanting to embrace a different gender from the one associated with their biology? And there are people in the church too who insist that you actually accept the language of transgender, whether it's cisgender or whatever, and this is now a way of dialogue between us. And unless you're prepared to even accept the language, then in a certain sense they feel that that's discrediting the church because we're no longer embracing and being alongside those people in the margins who are taking these positions. I think that we have to be sensible about gender and transitioning. We need to recognize it's not just a matter of sexuality, and it's certainly not just a matter of sexual preference. I mean, if we look at the statistics as to what's happened in the whole transgender area, for 50 years, 100 years, it used to be predominantly middle-aged men or men going towards middle age who then wanted to be women in some way or another. So you had a whole range of sex changes. That's changed completely. And now in the UK, certainly it's predominantly teenage girls who want to be boys. And of course, we've had huge debates about surgery and taking a knife to breasts and genitals and all of these kinds of things. And that continues to remain. So the issue is bigger than Trump. Unfortunately, Trump is there in the middle of the issue because he's just thrown this out and caused mayhem in all of the ideological oppositional networks that exist. And as well as being very, very interesting in the response to that, I think it's caused chaos. And I'm very sorry to see the feminist movement split up in this way. But I'm also very, very sorry to see Christians too now on polarized sides, and those Christians who are increasingly pro-Trump, and sometimes they're only pro-Trump because of what he said about gender, for nothing else. It seems to me to be a very, very big price to pay for a very small bit of platform of ideology that he's trying to mouth. So I think there's a lot of work Christians to do in this area to get the debate going in a proper way.
Elaine, thank you so much indeed for doing that off the cuff, so to speak. That was wonderful. So thanks to both of you. Just two quick comments before we go into breakout groups. I think this conversation shows how, although, our specific agenda we've defined as Christian political thought, Reformational political thought, this shows how the field of political thought is always going to be penetrated by and informed by and shaped by much broader concerns about theological anthropology, how we understand human nature, how we understand a much wider web of social relationships than just the political. The two can't be separated out. And the second thing that just to say is an interesting question I hope we'll discuss, I think we will, is how we assess the relative significance of this cluster of issues vis-a-vis all the other issues that have already been brought to bear in our two sessions in evaluating the Trump phenomena. What is the relative weight of this cluster of issues from a broadly reformed or reformational point of view?